I'm going to actually cover the second half. The first half was actually the part I really liked because that's the part from a conceptual point of view and the why point of view. I found really fascinating over the past few months as I've looked into PowerShell a lot more. So now, everyone here, if you're a software developer or related in the IT field, you have all the prerequisites required to learn PowerShell. PowerShell actually is a very straightforward language and scripting environment to work with. Even though a lot of the talks give it a very much an IT pro perspective, a lot of people I've been speaking to at Microsoft have been referring to it actually as P#, because it's actually becoming more and more of a fully functional language. And so even though it's coming from the IT pro section of DevOps, it's actually moving across into the developer area where it will be a fully functional language. So PowerShell 5 actually has added classes, it's object-oriented. It's really come a long way over the past 10 years. So the idea of PowerShell, I know people think of PowerShell really as a command line or command line type of tool, but there are many different environments to work with PowerShell. I won't go into all the details here, and if I go quickly enough, you'll actually be able to get out a little earlier too. But one of the things I found is the reluctance for people to get into PowerShell, and that's really one of the things I've been trying to focus on in this talk, is what is the reason for that? If this is such a powerful and useful technology and tool for you to use and to know, and everyone here has the capabilities to learn it, what is the reasons to hold people back? And one of the things I've thought about is that fear of the command prompt. I know that's one of the things that actually held me back from PowerShell, was that it looked like it was taking a giant step backwards when you started working with the prompt again. And it reminded me a lot of the MS-DOS prompt, as well as that whole DOS world where you work with command prompt. And I think the reason that people, and I'm really talking about my own perspective here, but I'm trying to share with you some of my insights in case it's helpful to you, but I'm quite comfortable that if you actually made this a priority and you wanted to learn it, you would. If you have a reason why, allocating the time to do so, it would be straightforward, and learning would be even simpler. The question then becomes also, the second part to that would be, what would you apply to? Something real, either for your own computing environment, your own software development purposes, or something company related that you work for. So, the other shell that's being introduced, and you may or may not have heard about this already, is the Linux Bash shell on Windows 10. So for people who are big fans of Linux, and Microsoft is now a big fan of Linux as well, in case you weren't aware of that, which I know it sounds strange, it feels like we've sort of gone around full circle. But the Linux Bash shell is available on Windows 10 as well. So this is for people who are already familiar with creating Bash shell scripts. It's not available on server at this point, and the reason for that from Microsoft is for security reasons. The way the Bash shell executes and the way it interacts with the computing platform doesn't fit well with the Windows Server platform. So right now it's restricted to Windows 10, and it's really very contained within Windows 10. Has anyone worked with the Bash shell on Windows 10 at all? Anyone? Okay, so as you can see, we're getting more command-based shell environments, not less. And the idea is that as far as the future is concerned, from an automation point of view, running a script and the command prompt is still the most efficient way. When Jeffrey Snover in that first video was talking about the click next administrator, he's talking about people who have become, and I've seen these people at these large corporations, where they have maybe a 10 or 20 page document called an enterprise change management plan, and it shows them instructions. It was, sorry?
Screenshot.
Yeah, yes, exactly. So what they do is they follow the script and they click on the buttons to install software. And when I raised this question of automation in those environments, surprisingly they were not that keen on it. They seem to think that this whole 10-page, 20-page document where they actually install software button by button click and so on was perfectly acceptable. So one of the things that I mentioned before was that by introducing this into one of our clients' environment, we reduced the team that actually rolls out our software from 12 down to 4. And that's had some interesting implications throughout as well. Now, PowerShell does not have to be restricted to a command prompt. There are several tools, and I'm going to just walk through some of them. Some of this you may have seen, some of them you may not have seen at all. At the end of this presentation, I'll provide a link that you can actually go to that is actually hosted on my company's website that has the best editors, the best tools, the best resources, the best scripts for PowerShell. Everything you actually need to work with PowerShell is already out there. Someone has already developed it to a large degree. You just need to get it, download it, customize it, add to it, maybe find a similar script that has some other functionality that you need, bring it into it, and you'd be very, very far along in meeting your requirements. I have yet to build any script for PowerShell that's non-trivial of any degree that I did not start with many other scripts before. Okay? So for people who actually want to work in that, you do not have to work in a simple text editor. PowerShell comes with an integrated scripting environment, so it's its own simple IDE environment that has an environment for both working with the code and actually executing it on the bottom portion of it, as well as a command reference on the right-hand side. What's more important, and it's evolved a lot since April 2015, when it first came out, is that PowerShell now has extensive integration with Visual Studio 2015. So if that's the environment that you feel comfortable working with, Microsoft has made significant investments in this area as well to work with it in an environment that you feel comfortable with. And that also applies to Visual Studio Code. So PowerShell is no longer something you just need to work with on the command level. Now, those are the two offerings from Microsoft. There are actually quite a few other environments out there as well, such as PowerShell plus IDE from Idea Software, which again gives you another very fully functional, very rich environment that people are typically expecting now when doing software development. So PowerShell itself can be scripted and managed in an environment that is much more comfortable than, say, a simple text editor. The other one, now this one is actually an interesting one, PowerShell Studio 2015. This is not free, but when you look at what it provides a lot of extensions to PowerShell that are fully compatible with Windows and the Windows environments. But what you get though, besides a fully featured editor, you also get GUI tools. So PowerShell now can generate very fully functional user interfaces as well. And what that allows you to do is give users a rich feedback process. So if the administrator is someone that simply can't run a script from the command prompt but has to interact with it based on certain real-time requirements or get feedback in real time, you can actually use this to actually generate different types of visual elements to the PowerShell script that can interact with any of the end users you need, such as administrators. It also allows things such as installation processes as well as convert scripts into executable files. So the idea is that you actually then the PowerShell script actually becomes a standalone program. You add user interfaces and you have a very powerful administrative tool. It's still a PowerShell script, but feels a lot more like a programming language that we're typically used to. So PowerShell fundamentals. So it's actually a very straightforward environment to work with. If anyone works with SQL Server or any of that kind of environment where you're typically used to typing a command, getting some results, and looking at the results and then using it to feed back into your process, where you then extend those commands and sort of build up on that process, the PowerShell scripting process works the same way. That's what my experience has been. It becomes a very intuitive process where using things like get command to list the commands, get help, get member, all of these linked together can provide all the information from a self-discovery point of view on what you need to learn to use PowerShell. Now, as far as PowerShell, its purpose, and a lot of things that we use it for at my company, such as provisioning virtual machines, managing virtual infrastructures, we used to actually manage and build these Hyper-V virtual machines manually. write down with the ISO an image to install the software and so on. We're now actually built it up fully using PowerShell. Now, what that also means is that those PowerShell scripts can be used locally to build out a server locally on the Windows 10 laptop. It can be used in our server environment. We have 2 data centers that we use, one in Barrie and one in Toronto. And that same shell script, PowerShell script, can be used to actually build out that same server in that environment, in those 2 different environments. Now, what's interesting also is that you can actually use that script now in Azure as well. So you now have a script, a PowerShell script, that allows you to build out a machine, whether it's whatever requirements for that machine are, in any of those environments. And what you have is you can put those under source control, and you now have a level of control and management to your infrastructure that is simply not possible by using a manual methodology. Software build process, deployment, all these elements that you see here for PowerShell scripts, all of these are already available online. And what you'll find is that on this link here, and I'm going to go to it shortly, I'm going to walk you through a little bit of what's available here. And what we do is we add to this over time. So you'll find all the third-party editors, the PowerShell script resources, all from this link that's provided. And I'll actually add it to the meetup page as well. And what you have here is the best of what's out there in PowerShell. There's always maybe something a little more subtle or nuanced that you're looking for. You can always search for using Google, but you will find that the best of the PowerShell resources are available right here, and including ebooks and cheat sheets. As far as learning is concerned, you'll find that there's an extensive available listing of PowerShell videos that you can actually walk through and get you up and running very, very quickly. Now, one thing that is not on this list actually is GitHub. GitHub actually has an extensive, and I'm just going to bring it up here just to give you an idea of what it looks like here. Just about anything you could be looking for or will need, you'll find either on GitHub or the little repositories that I pointed out to you previously. The amount of scripts available are truly remarkable. I mean, really, if there's anything you need to write yourself, I'd be surprised. Generally what I find is that working with one main script and then augmenting it with any other features and functionality you need from other scripts will get you 90 to 95% of the way, if not 100% to the point you need to get to with PowerShell. And it's surprising that the quality of the information available, I'm just going to pick one randomly here. Let's say PowerShell scripts for SQL Server Database Administration. Let's have a look at that here. SQL check. Let's have a look at that. So what you'll find is, like this and all the other code and scripts available, very easy to follow functions of PowerShell functionality that you can use collectively or individually to extend out anything you need to build and manage yourself, whether it's in a local environment, whether it's in a server environment, or even in Azure as well. Okay, and one last thing I'm going to show you here is, just in case you haven't explored it yourself, PowerShell itself is always straightforward to find, especially under Windows 10. It goes back all the way back to Windows XP. But under Windows 10, you'll find PowerShell version 5, and you'll find there's 2 flavors of it. One is the 32-bit version of the command prompt version of PowerShell, as well as the integrated scripting environment, and then the 64-bit environments as well. So all of them are sitting under Windows PowerShell. The other thing you can actually do as well is, if you right-click on the taskbar there and click on Properties, and under Navigation, you can actually change the command prompt to a Windows PowerShell prompt. So that becomes the default interaction with your environment. Instead of the command prompt, the PowerShell prompt. So you have access to all the normal directory commands and other functionality you would do from the command prompt, but you also have full access to PowerShell as well. Okay, so by simply selecting that option, you are good to go and on that replacement there. So, the last part I want to add is that learning PowerShell is actually a very straightforward process. And it's one of those things that as soon as you make it a priority and you want to use it and learn it and apply it to a specific problem you want to solve, a problem that you may or may not know exists yet, you will find that PowerShell actually is a very powerful tool for that. It's one of those things that as we started exploring the use of it, and I'll give you an example of it, just a typical one we've used internally. We have about 150 reports that are built-in Crystal reports that we actually, in the past, would take 3 people about a week to go through about 150 reports, running them against the data source, saving them as PDFs or Excel data for verification and so on. So that would take 3 people about a week. Now in 1 hour, a PowerShell script will automatically load up those reports, target the database, and will also set up through operational parameters for that script. So you change the target of the database and so on, or how deep we want to go into report structure. It will run all those reports against that targeted database, generate an Excel file, PDF file, CSV file, and what it does, it also keeps a historical track of those files, so you can then do a diff on the files over time and find if they start to diverge from the baseline file. So in 1 hour, all those files have been run and verified as correct and unchanged from the baseline. So that's a typical example that it's not something you would typically say, oh, I need to run these reports in an automated fashion. What you start to look at is how do you do this more efficiently? If it's taking so many people, a certain number of people, so many hours to do this or days to do this, can PowerShell do this for you? And so PowerShell is not something you automatically jump to as a solution to a problem that you may not think about, because maybe having 3 people work on something for a week may be acceptable. Just like in certain large corporations, having 12 people work on something for 3 months that you can now do in an automated fashion in a few days with PowerShell. The prior experience of those 12 people and that environment, that was the norm. And using PowerShell redefines what is normal and what is acceptable and what's possible through automation and these kind of tools. So, and that's all I have to say on this topic. The rest is really hope that you actually do have a chance to go and explore PowerShell further. Are there any questions?
Which of those PowerShell IDs do you like the best?
Actually, I'm using Visual Studio 2015.
Okay.
I started playing around with it, but it's gotten so good now. And actually, even Visual Studio Code is really nice as well. So I find that I'm still sticking with the 2 Microsoft ones. Those, until they became available over the past 6 months to 8 months, before that, there was no option from Microsoft except the integrated scripting environment, which is pretty basic compared to what we're used to. And that's why all those IDs were very exceptional. But now with Visual Studio 2015 and Visual Studio Code, I've just gone back to that environment. I know it well, I feel comfortable in that environment. Actually, one other point I was going to mention when you this, as you know, Visual Studio Code is meant to run on Linux and the Mac as well, OS 10. PowerShell runs with .NET, and they're actually looking to move PowerShell fully to .NET Core, which means that as soon as you move PowerShell to .NET Core, PowerShell can also theoretically be portable as well. So not only are they bringing the Linux bash shell to Windows, they're looking to move PowerShell. Even though people are not talking about it, you can see that's the direction they're moving to, at least from things that they invested in. That PowerShell is meant to be also cross-platform as well, eventually. Because as Microsoft embraces other technologies such as Linux and the Apple operating environment as well, you want a tool that they have invested deeply in as part of their management infrastructure to work in those environments as well. Yes.
Okay, so first a disclaimer that I'm all pro this, and in fact I've used Linux as a chosen platform because of automation.
Yes.
But since I'm here, might as well have fun playing a devil's advocate for a second.
Sure.
So back in the day, early 2000s, there was no automation like this to speak of. Instead, what we had were capturing tools. So if I had like over 100 computers in companies that I was managing, I would create some kind of like perfect images of something that I wanted to do. So like your next scripts, I would run through them, and then I would use tools from places like Symantec or Acronis and all of those who would compete on how well and how accurate they could capture the perfect image and be able to deploy it. And then they could also give you option to export it, so you can do your version control that you proposed here. And they weren't the best. They weren't. The export wasn't necessarily accurate, and the deployment wasn't necessarily reliable. So out of 100 computers, maybe 99 get deployed. So, and then now I see the infrastructure as code, and every time I see someone do, and one thing that the capturing tools would allow you to do is because you had forms to fill them all out, so you had inherent a validation of what you're doing. So you can't really make a mistake when you say, I want the software deployed to the computers that have these particular features, because they would show up immediately as you build a query. But now, every time I see someone use a deployment tool in coders infrastructure as code style, they make typos, they make syntax errors, they don't have the immediate feedback of where the scripts are even being deployed to, because they don't really see the result of the queries until damage is done. So my question is, why did we not further develop and polish those forms and capturing tools to do the automation, and instead went less reliable scripting way to do automation?
Yes, what you're talking about is how by using the scripts purely the way they are right now, typos can cause all sorts of problems that people find out.
And you don't even know what's available, because you just type in, as opposed to a form where you fill it out and you have immediate feedback.
Sure. Actually, one of the things I found very useful is if you look at the Azure and Azure Stack available coming along, a lot of the machines that you could build out for that environment will actually also produce a PowerShell script for you as well.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you're talking about some sort of safe templated environment that you simply use drop down the checkboxes and you pick everything safely and correctly, and then it'll automatically generate for you.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, there's no tool like that, but actually Azure itself does a lot of that now too. I mean, before, and a lot of demonstration that you see on Azure is all clicking screens and buttons and so on. That's good for a demonstration, that's good for maybe a few machines, but if you have 100 machines to provision and do it on a recurring basis, you're not going to actually do it manually. And so a lot of these things that you could do in Azure can have script generated as part of that as well. So what you're saying is, it's just that evolution of it is still coming.
You write a script, it's code, and you write tests to test your script.
Yeah, just don't do
your
tests,
code.
Yeah. Also, I mean, I'm familiar with the software you're talking about, because I used to use Ghost.
Yes, Ghost is
Ghost was a
amazing.
very popular one. I used to use that. See, back in those days, you would actually image physically from drive to drive, machine to machine. Now the script is building a virtual machine, which is inherently disposable. So if
Yes,
it's not
so-
correct, you just dispose of it, right? And that's the difference. And that's what he's talking about. Snowflake servers, and they're not pets, they're cattle that can be simply disposed of. As soon as you move away from physical assets like laptops and servers and hard drives to virtual machines, mistakes actually don't make a difference, because when you build it out as part of the test and it doesn't come up exactly the way you want it, you can dispose of it. And if the build is so quick, it's not like the old days with Ghost. Ghost would be running for hours, right? Sometimes creating an image. Now you're talking about in minutes, you have a full virtual machine up and running, and you can just check it and confirm it's working correctly.
Now what about patching then? Would you consider taking that to extreme and delete all of the old unpatched ones and replace them with a patched one, or would you take the existing cells and push the patches in, which does require accuracy?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, we used to have the habit of patching our machines, but the problem is you start patching a non-trivial amount of machines, let's say 10, 20, 50. Plus, we have a lot of VDIs. We use our machines, our laptops, only as a front end to our virtual desktops in our own private cloud. So after a while, that's a lot of patching that someone has to monitor and check and so on. And what we started to do is we finally moved to the DevOps model, which is the disposable. So you don't actually patch it, you delete it, and you actually get the new image and you build it from that. And it's so fast and efficient. And the software installation process is automated as well. If you go to that next step, you don't actually worry about that. It can now fully be automated to that level. So they're disposable.
And that's good because it's also helps with the disaster recovery. So if they
Yes.
go down, you can. But the fact that you always have a practiced and well ironed out deployment process, even for something that's patching, when they do break, then you will have that orchestrated.
Yes. I can tell you from my own experience working with like a large bank, even virtual machines, they treat as sacred. They're afraid to update it, they're afraid to change it. When I told them to just delete it and build a new one, they couldn't believe I said that. It took them like 6 months, I don't know how many emails and paperwork to actually build out the first image of it, so I can't imagine how long it would take them. So the concept of deleting an image and rebuilding it was just completely foreign to them. And it's, even for myself and my team, it took a little while before we got comfortable with that they are disposable. And as soon as you get into that mentality, automation and PowerShell become very powerful.
So last thing for that, where do you draw the line between disposable and something that's infrastructure based? Like you don't want to dispose your DNS all the time, you don't want to dispose your database all the time. How do you distinguish between what should be there solid and is precious and versus something that is disposable?
Well, a lot of the examples that they talk about, especially from a high level enterprise DevOps perspective, everything should be redundant, right? So if you're talking about let's say your AD server, one of them has gone completely nuts, you should be able to shut it down and fail over to another machine and then rebuild that one, right? Same thing with DNS. DNS, there's never a single DNS server used. There's always multiple versions. So one should be able to be taken off, or two, and then rebuilt while the other one takes the traffic for that. And especially with a lot of the new environments, the memory allocation and CPUs can be dynamically increased as required, so they can take a much more extensive load over time as well. So there's a lot of options there. So as long as you're never dealing with, and there should never be a single instance of anything that's so critical, DNS servers, AD servers, and so on, any one of them should be able to be taken offline, the rest picking up the workload, and then the new one brought back online. Any other questions?
Do you have Intellisense in PowerShell?
Intellisense.
Intellisense has built-in.
There's
Yeah.
AdSense.
Yeah.
PowerShell
Yeah.
built-in Intellisense.
Yeah. I was thinking some of the add-on tools and so on, they really make good use of those tools, but Visual Studio now has caught up to the point that you don't actually need any of those tools. So yeah, I find Visual Studio Code is amazing actually. It's a really nice environment, and it feels very lightweight compared to Visual Studio, which is pretty big if you just want to work with PowerShell. So. Well, thank you all. Thanks for coming out.